Hi there. Time to wrap up our discussion of respiratory anatomy. At this point, we are going to zoom all the way in to those alveoli, and we're going to look at the microanatomy. So what exactly is happening with the cells that make up these structures? Well, the alveoli themselves are surrounded by tissue that is collectively called the respiratory membrane. Okay, so for some context here, we have inhaled air all the way from our nasal cavity way down to the terminal bronchioles, the respiratory bronchioles branched off into the alveolar ducts, and then finally into the alveoli themselves, where most gas exchange is going to occur. If we were to zoom into this little section right here, this is what we would see. All right, so let us take a look at the membrane itself, what is making up those alveolar walls, and essentially what does oxygen and carbon dioxide have to pass through in order to get into those capillaries, which we talked about in the last video, and finally into the blood. Well, the respiratory membrane has to have a couple characteristics in order to facilitate the most efficient respiration or gas exchange possible. A couple of those characteristics, the ones that we're going to focus on, are first of all, it needs to be thin. And second of all, it needs to have fluid. And so organisms, we essentially evolved from organisms that were aquatic. And so to get oxygen into our ancestors, essentially blood, it was really easy. Oxygen was already in the water and could very easily slip into the blood. When our ancestors moved out of the water and onto land, we never really got away from the water. We just kind of brought some of that water with us. And so the alveoli must be lined with a thin layer of water. And there's a couple of things in there, but mostly it's water, some kind of fluid, into which oxygen must first dissolve before it is able to cross over the membrane and into the blood. Okay, so we need to have a super thin membrane to limit the flow of oxygen as much as possible, and we need fluid so oxygen can dissolve. Okay, so what we ultimately have is a approximately half a micrometer thick air-blood barrier. Right, so for some context, this is like a 40th the thickness of a piece of tissue paper. Okay, so very, very, very thin membrane, the thinnest possible membrane to limit, or the thinnest possible membrane so that oxygen diffusion is limited the least. Okay, so what this barrier is an alveolar wall. So we can see here, this is a simple squamous epithelial tissue. So one skinny little cell. Cells do not get skinnier than epithelial cells. And so the alveolar cell is super skinny. Right next to it is the capillary, the endothelial cell, and it too is as thin as possible. Yes, it is a continuous capillary, so there's not like big gaps or anything between the cells, but literally these are the thinnest cells we can possibly make. And of course, we fuse them together with the basement membranes, and together, both of those cell layers turns out to be this super skinny barrier. Okay, so let's look a little bit more at the alveolar cells and the alveoli themselves. This diagram looks a little bit different, but showing us kind of the same things. Here is your capillary, so blood flowing through. Here's the endothelium, all right, super skinny barrier, keeping blood cells in, but allowing things like oxygen and CO2 to diffuse. This is the alveolus, so air is here in blue. We can see those simple squamous cells there, right, thinnest possible membrane. So let's dive in a little bit more. The alveolar membrane is not completely continuous. It does contain some pores, so some little holes that allows stuff to go from one alveolus to the next, right? So it connects adjacent alveoli. This allows air pressure to equalize throughout them. And in the next video, which is not not done by me, a little bit of a different perspective, little animation for you. It's going to show you some of the consequences of equalizing air pressure in the alveoli. Also, the alveolar membrane allows macrophages. Right? We learned about macrophages in the cardiovascular system. These are white blood cells that escape from the capillaries and essentially just kind of patrol around in our tissues. Here in the lungs, they try to capture anything that made it past all of those other defense mechanisms that we have, right? So it's gotten past the mucus, it got past all of that turbulence in the nasal cavity. The little cilia weren't able to push this up and out and everything. Whatever makes it past all those things, the macrophages are like little Roombas, and they kind of go through and they are going to suck up anything that doesn't quite belong. That is, anything that is solid. Okay. The alveolar membrane also has some fine elastic fibers in it. It's just like we briefly looked at before. Okay. The alveolar membrane itself is composed primarily of those type 1 alveolar cells, so simple squamous epithelial cells, thinnest membrane possible. But you might note that there are other types of cells as well. And these, of course, are not super skinny. These are not meant for diffusion of gases. Instead, they have a lot of other functions. These are called type 2 alveolar cells. They are essentially cuboidal cells, just one layer thick, right? Just kind of interspersed in the alveolar membrane. And again, they are not for gas exchange. Among other functions, they are critically important in secreting something that's called surfactant. Now remember that we have to line our alveoli with water, okay? But by doing so, there are some consequences. It's a lot harder to inflate alveoli if there's water in them. Essentially, the water is always kind of pulling them to get smaller and smaller. And so type 2 alveolar cells secrete something to combat that surface tension. In the next video, you are going to learn all about surfactant and what its benefits are and what would happen if there wasn't surfactant, which is important to us clinically because there are conditions that limit the activity of type 2 alveolar cells, therefore limit the production of surfactant, and the type 2 alveolar cells aren't fully producing sufficient surfactant for a while during fetal development. And ultimately at the beginning of your life. And so this is very troublesome, particularly if you are a preemie, because it is just so much more difficult to inflate your lungs, right? To expand your lungs to inhale if you are not producing sufficient surfactant. And later this term we will, or later in this unit, we will kind of loop back around to that concept again. So that was the end of my introduction to respiratory anatomy. One more short clip so that you can learn all about surfactant. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time.